She saved a gorilla cub from the shelter, now he saved her life. The rain in the Virunga Mountains does not fall in droplets, it falls in sheets that swallow the horizon, turning the lush green canopy into a blurred gray ghost of itself. Elena stood at the very edge of a jagged ravine, her breath coming in ragged gasps that mirrored the rising wind. Beneath her heavy boots, the earth was no longer solid. The red volcanic mud had turned into a slick, treacherous slurry. Far below, the river was a churning throat of brown water and shattered timber, roaring with the fury of 1,000 storms. She could hear it then, a sound that sliced through the thunder, a low, rhythmic grunting that vibrated in her very marrow. It was a call she hadn't heard in a decade, a specific sequence of vocalizations she had once recorded in a cold, sterile room thousands of miles away. As the ground gave way and she began her terrifying plunge into the dark abyss, Elena realized with a jolt of pure adrenaline that the cycle had finally come full circle. The woman who had spent her life reaching into cages to pull out the broken was now the one falling, and there were no human hands to catch her. But before we continue, subscribe so you don't miss another touching story like this one, and write in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is there. The story of Elena and Kibo did not begin under the open sky of Africa. It began in the shadows of a municipal animal shelter on the outskirts of a gray industrial city. Elena was 32 years old then, a woman with kind but tired eyes and an athletic build that spoke of years spent in the field rather than behind a desk. She always wore a faded olive-green jacket, its pockets stuffed with syringes, notebooks, and a silver whistle that hung from a leather cord around her neck. That whistle was her tool, her signal, and her anchor. It was a Tuesday in the dead of winter when Kibo arrived. He was a western lowland gorilla, but you wouldn't have known it by looking at him then. He looked like a discarded pile of wet, matted rags. At 5 months old, he should have been clingy, curious, and full of the chaotic energy of a primate infant. Instead, he sat in the corner of a concrete enclosure, his head bowed so low his chin touched his chest. He had been confiscated from a smuggler's warehouse, hidden in a crate so small he had forgotten how to stretch his limbs. The most striking thing about him, even in his state of total withdrawal, was a patch of lighter silver-tinted fur on his right shoulder, a natural birthmark that looked like a thumbprint from an angel. For the first week, Kibo was a ghost. He refused the specialized formula, ignored the mashed bananas, and turned his back on the enrichment toys the staff provided. The shelter director, a man hardened by years of seeing the worst of humanity, shook his head as he watched Elena try to coax the cub toward the bars. He told her that some souls are simply too bruised to stay in their bodies. He warned her that gorillas are social creatures of such high intelligence that once they decide the world is no longer worth participating in, they simply stop. They drift away into a sleep from which no medicine can wake them. Elena refused to accept that verdict. She saw the way Kibo's amber eyes occasionally flickered toward the silver whistle on her chest. She saw the way his fingers, tiny and wrinkled like those of an old man, would twitch in his sleep. She knew he wasn't just sick, he was grieving a world that had been ripped away. She decided to do something the shelter protocols strictly forbade. She brought a sleeping bag into the enclosure. Day 4 of the rescue was the turning point. The air in the shelter was cold, and the smell of bleach was suffocating. Elena sat on the floor, her back against the cold concrete, and began to hum. It wasn't a song with lyrics, but a deep, vibrating resonance that she felt in her chest. For hours she sat there, a woman in an olive jacket and a dying gorilla cub, separated by 3 feet of space and a universe of trauma. Slowly, almost imperceptibly, Kibo began to move. He didn't walk, he dragged himself across the floor, his breath hitching in his chest. When he reached Elena, He didn't bite or scratch. He leaned his small, bony frame against her thigh and let out a long, shuddering sigh. Elena reached down and tucked him into the folds of her jacket. She felt his heart beating against her hip, fast, erratic, but stubborn. She stayed that way for 14 hours, refusing to move even when her legs went numb. She realized then that Kibo didn't need a vet, he needed a mother. He needed to know that his heartbeat wasn't the only one left in the world. By the next morning, for the first time since his capture, Kibo drank. He didn't just drink, he fought for the bottle, his small hands gripping Elena's fingers with a strength that brought tears to her eyes. As the months passed, the transformation was nothing short of miraculous. Kibo grew. The silver patch on his shoulder became a bright badge of health. He became obsessed with Elena's silver whistle. Every time she blew it to signal a meal or a move to the outdoor play area, Kibo would let out a series of joyous hoots, tumbling over himself to reach her. He would sit in her lap, his deep-set eyes watching her face with an intensity that felt almost human. He was no longer a victim, he was a survivor. But Elena knew that the more he thrived, the closer they got to the hardest part of the journey. The sanctuary in the Virunga Mountains was the goal. It was a place where gorillas could be gorillas, away from the concrete and the bleach and the noise of the city. When the day of the transfer arrived, the air was thick with a different kind of tension. Elena traveled with him, sitting beside his transport crate, whispering to him through the mesh. When they reached the clearing in the heart of the forest, the beauty of the world seemed to overwhelm them both. The emerald green of the canopy, the mist rolling off the peaks, and the scent of damp earth and wild orchids. When the crate door opened, Kibo didn't bolt. He stepped out cautiously, his knuckles pressing into the rich soil. He looked at the towering trees, then back at Elena. She stood by the jeep, her hand clutched around her silver whistle. She wanted to blow it. She wanted to call him back to the safety of her lap. But she knew that would be a betrayal. "Go on, Kibo," she whispered, her voice cracking. "This is where you belong." Kibo paused. He looked at the silver patch on his own shoulder, then at the silver whistle around Elena's neck. He let out a single, deep grunt, a sound of acknowledgement, and then, with a grace that belied his growing size, he disappeared into the thick foliage. Elena stood there until the sun went down, the silence of the forest feeling heavier than any noise she had ever known. 10 years passed. Elena stayed in the Virungas, transitioning from a shelter vet to a field researcher. She dedicated her life to the protection of the mountain gorillas, tracking their movements and documenting their social structures. She had seen Kibo from a distance over the years. He had grown into a magnificent silverback, a 400-pound titan of muscle and silver-black fur. He had a notch in his left ear from a fight with a rival, and he led a troop of 6 females and several infants. He was the king of his sector, a stern but fair leader who kept his family safe. Elena never approached him. She followed the rules of the forest. She remained a shadow, an observer, a guardian from afar. Then came the Tuesday morning in late October, exactly 10 years to the month since they had first met. The weather in the mountains can turn from a paradise to a death trap in a matter of minutes. A massive storm system had stalled over the peaks, dumping inches of rain onto the unstable volcanic soil. Elena had been out alone, checking a series of remote acoustic sensors when the mountain decided to move. It started with a sound like a freight train, the terrifying roar of a mudslide. Before she could react, the ground beneath her gave way. Elena tumbled down a steep embankment, her body battered by rocks and falling branches. She felt a sickening snap in her right leg as it caught between 2 boulders, and then she was airborne, falling 15 feet down onto a narrow, crumbling ledge that overhung a violent river. She lay there in the mud, the rain blinding her. The pain in her leg was a white hot iron, radiating up into her hip. She tried to pull herself up, but the ledge was less than 3 feet wide and was vibrating with the force of the river below. She was trapped. Her radio had been smashed in the fall, and the research camp was miles away. The cold began to set in, that deep, hollow chill that slows the heart and clouds the mind. She reached for the only thing she had left. Her fingers, slick with mud and trembling with shock, found the silver whistle. She pulled it to her lips and blew. The sound was thin against the roar of the storm, but she didn't stop. She blew until her lungs ached. She blew the rhythm she had used at the shelter, the call for feeding, the call for safety, the call for home. For an hour, there was nothing but the rain. Then, the bushes at the top of the ravine began to part. A massive shadow emerged. It was Kibo. He didn't look like the cub she had held in her jacket. He was a mountain of a creature, his eyes glowing with a fierce, wild intelligence. He looked down at the woman on the ledge, his head tilting to the side. The silver whistle blew one more time, a weak, sputtering note. Kibo didn't hesitate. He began to descend the near-vertical slope with a terrifying speed. He used his massive arms to anchor himself, his knuckles digging into the earth to create handholds. When he reached the ledge, it groaned under his immense weight. Elena looked up, her vision blurring, seeing the notch in his ear and the silver patch on his shoulder. "Kibo," she whispered, the name barely a breath. The silverback didn't make a sound. He reached out with a hand that could have easily crushed her skull. Instead, he slipped his arm under her waist, lifting her with a gentleness that seemed impossible for a creature of his size. He tucked her against his broad, warm chest, shielding her from the freezing rain. He didn't climb back up the way he came. He knew the mud was too unstable. Instead, he moved laterally along the cliff face, carrying her through the thorns and the darkness. He carried her for nearly 3 miles, navigating the treacherous terrain in total darkness. Elena drifted in and out of consciousness, but every time she opened her eyes, she felt the steady, powerful thrum of his heartbeat against her ear. It was the same rhythm she had given him 10 years ago. As the first light of dawn broke through the clouds, the search party from the research station saw something they would never forget. A massive silverback gorilla emerged from the tree line, walking upright for several paces as he stepped onto the cleared helipad of the station. He walked to the very center of the concrete, knelt down, and placed a shivering, mud-covered woman on the ground. He didn't linger. He didn't wait for the humans to approach. He let out one long, deep grunt, the sound of a debt repaid, and turned back toward the mountains. By the time the medics reached Elena, Kibo was nothing more than a shadow in the mist. In the weeks of recovery that followed, Elena often thought about the lost cause the shelter director had described. She thought about how the world views these creatures as animals, as subordinates, as things to be managed. But she knew better. She knew that in the heart of the forest there is a memory that doesn't fade, and a bond that isn't broken by time or distance. Kibo hadn't saved her because of a whistle. He had saved her because he knew what it felt like to be held when the world was falling apart. The silver whistle still hangs around Elena's neck, but she rarely blows it now. She doesn't need to. Sometimes, on the quiet nights when the moon is full over the Virungas, she hears a deep, resonant hooting coming from the sector of the forest where the king with the silver shoulder resides. She simply smiles and hums a low, vibrating tune back into the darkness. The mother's voice and the son's strength had found each other across a decade of silence. Did this story touch your heart? And do you believe that animals can remember a kindness even after many years? Write yes or no in the comments below. Like this video and subscribe to our channel for more incredible stories of the bond between humans and nature. Thank you so much for watching. See you in the next one. Bye.